Okay, so we were talking about how there's three propositions of common sense morality, and last time we got through the first one, and the second one a little bit we got into. So just to remind you, the first proposition was an action has moral worth only if it is done from the motive of duty. And there, Kant gave his example of the shopkeeper. The example of the shopkeeper was somebody who actually does something that appears to be a good action. He tells the truth. He states the fair price of an item in his store. But Kant proposes this example of where somebody does that out of crass self-interest. The only reason he's doing it is because he doesn't want to get in trouble. He's pursuing happiness. He's acting out of inclination. He tells the fair price, but he does it because he wants his business to flourish and he wants to make money, and he sees this as a means to an end to make money. So Kant thinks that the action of the shopkeeper, even though he technically did the right thing, his action really has no genuine moral worth because it wasn't done with the right intention. Okay, so we talked about how for Kant, intention is so important. It will determine whether your action is right or wrong, is morally worthy. Okay, that was proposition number one. Based on that proposition, we moved to proposition number two, which was that an action is going to have moral worth not because of the consequences, but only in virtue of the maxim under which the action was done. Okay, and I know we started saying that the first half of that statement really is anti-consequentialism. He disagrees with consequentialism. And who is our favorite consequentialist that we study this semester? Most clearly it would be Mill, right? Mill is a consequentialist, social happiness, that's the goal. Okay, so Kant disagrees with Mill about consequentialism. But then Kant says, okay, well then what is it that would make something morally worthy? It has to do with the maxim under which the action was done. So just to go over that concept again of a maxim is a rule. It has to have a general form. Whenever I'm in circumstances X, I will do action Y. Okay, so maxims can be very, very simple and straightforward. They can get complicated, but a maxim will always have that form. Whenever I'm in circumstances X, I will do action Y. And Kant thinks that whenever we choose to act, we are going to be acting on the basis of a maxim. Even if we don't say it out loud, even if we just sort of unconsciously think about it, whenever we choose to act, we're acting on the basis of a maxim. Okay, so if I say to myself, I'm feeling really thirsty now, I think I'll go have a drink. And I choose to act on that thirst, really what I'm saying to myself is, this is who I am. This is the kind of person I am. In general, when I'm thirsty, I go get drinks, okay? If I come home every day at 4 o'clock or 4:30 and I have a vodka tonic, then I choose to have that vodka tonic at 4:30, and I say to myself, this is the kind of person I am. Whenever I come home at 4:30, I have a vodka tonic. That's the kind of person I am. All right, so anytime you act according to Kant, you must be either unconsciously or consciously choosing to act on the basis of some rule, and that's what a maxim is. All right, so now going back to that second proposition, what did it say? The latter half was, an action will have genuine moral worth only because of the maxim under which it is done. Now, we shouldn't misunderstand this. He's not saying that as long as you have any old maxim, your action's going to have moral worth. That is not what he's saying. He's not saying any maxim. He's saying there's going to be some thing about a maxim that makes it a morally good one, and then there are going to be many maxims that are not morally good or morally worthy to act on. Okay, so there are many, many maxims that a person can have, some of which are going to be moral and some of which are going to be immoral. Okay, I'll give you an example of a maxim that I think we would all agree is immoral to act on. Whenever I need money, I go rob a bank. That could be somebody's maxim, right? Whenever I'm in need of money, I go steal from other people. That could be somebody's maxim. And we would all agree that that's not a morally worthy or good maxim to act on, right? Okay, so getting back to proposition number 2, what he's saying over there is it's not the consequences. We've ruled that out. And what must be the case is that there's something about the maxim that's going to make it morally worthwhile. And we still have yet to figure out how do we distinguish morally good maxims from morally bad maxims. Okay? So we're going to get there, but let's move on to proposition number 3. Okay, so there is a third proposition, and then we're going to get to what he thinks is the fundamental moral principle. So the third proposition goes like this: an action has genuine moral worth if it is done out of respect for the moral law. Okay? You think you got that? An action has genuine moral worth if it is done out of respect for the moral law. Now, basically what this means is an action has moral worth if and only if the person did it because it was the right thing to do. That had to be their motive. Their motive was, I'm doing this because it's right. If there's any other motive that's mixed in there, selfishness, happiness, pleasure, promoting some kind of a consequence, that's going to be bad, or that's going to take away from the moral worth of the action. Okay? You should, if your action is really morally worthy, it's going to be an action that you did just because you recognize that this was the right thing to do, and that's why you did it. Okay? So in a way, this third proposition, this so-called third proposition, is not really adding too much to what we've been saying already. You might say this third proposition is basically saying the same thing we just said, that he believes that you only have moral worth in your action if you did it because it was right. But he does introduce 2 new concepts here, or 2 new terms. One is respect for the moral law. We got respect, and now we have this idea of a moral law. So let's just talk a little bit about this term respect. Respect sometimes can mean, Kant wrote in German, so I don't know German, and I don't know what word he used in German to mean what we take to be respect, but in English at least, respect can sometimes indicate a certain kind of emotion or a feeling. Like when we speak about having respect for your elders, or respect for your parents, respect for your, philosophy professor. Well, maybe not. Okay, anyway, respect can sometimes connote a kind of like for example, if we talk about having respect for God. Okay, so whether you happen to be religious or not, the idea is that respect seems to connote sometimes an emotion of awe, A-W-E, right? You know what I'm talking about? Reverence, awe. Like you go into a church, you're supposed to have a certain decorum and respect. So respect can sometimes refer to a certain kind of feeling or emotion of reverence for something. And Kant probably has more in mind something intellectual, something like an intellectual recognition. Do you remember when we talked about with Plato this idea of the double motivation theory? Some of you may recall that with Plato we said, and also with Aquinas later on, but that was for God. With Plato we talked about recognition of the good, that Plato thought that just by recognizing what the good is, you're going to be inspired to do good deeds, like help the people out of the cave, remember? Right? So that's kind of similar to what I think Kant has in mind over here. It's not respect for God. He's not using God here in this proposition number 3. And by the way, this is maybe a good place to point out that Kant's theory of morality does not depend on God or a belief in God. All right? This is not a religious or a theistic theory. It's different from Aquinas. Whether Kant, I don't think by any means Kant was not an atheist. He was in some way known to be some kind of a Christian, all right? So we don't need to spend too much time talking about Kant's beliefs or disbeliefs about God, but one thing that's important to bear in mind, or for our purposes, is that Kant's theory of morality is not based on a belief in God, does not require. Kant would say that even if God doesn't exist, he would still have the exact same theory of morality, pretty much, okay? So it's not respect for the good, it's not respect for God, it's respect for the moral law. That's it. That is what a genuinely moral action is going to be, is one that's done. I did it just because the moral law told me. Well, moral laws don't speak. They're not, God or people, but the moral law can be recognized using reason, and we haven't gotten there yet, but that's going to be the next thing we get to. But using reason, we can figure out what the moral is, and then once we know what the moral law is, we can act out of respect for it. So I think Kant, this is a bit of a complicated question. To what degree would Kant say that there could be some emotion or feeling or passion mixed into a motive as to why a person does what he does morally? I think what Kant wants to say is the main motive should be coming from reason, right? You understand, you realize this is the moral law. You may have a bit of a feeling or a passion that kicks in and says, oh, I really want to do this. But the important thing, even if you didn't have the passion and the emotion and the feeling and the inspiration, you still can choose to act based on reason. So you don't really need the emotional part. What you really need is the recognition, the intellectual understanding that something really is the moral law, and that can motivate you to choose to act on the basis of the moral law. Okay, so anyway, that's proposition number 3. An action has genuine moral worth only if it is done out of respect for the moral law. And now we are finally getting to something really important. I mean, all of this is important, but now what we're getting to is really super important. Kant is going to try to take us through a little thought process where we can actually discover what the fundamental moral law is. Okay? So I'll tell you what, I'm going to write on the board what the fundamental moral law is according to Kant. And it may sound at first to be a little bit bizarre and weird, but then we'll backtrack and we'll try to explain why he thinks this is true. And then what I'm going to do is, what's very nice is that Kant gives 4 examples of how this law is supposed to work in practice to help us figure out what is right or wrong. Okay? So we're going to go through his examples. But this, according to Kant, is the fundamental moral principle. An action is morally permissible if it is based on a maxim which a person could will to become a universal law, for all rational beings. And I'm going to add without contradiction. And let me also say, in parentheses, if the maxim is not, and I'm going to use this word, universalizable, then the action morally wrong. Okay, this is kind of just the flip side of this. Again, actions are based on maxims. Every time you choose to do an action, you're assuming, you're basing your action on some kind of maxim. And then there's going to be what is sometimes called the universalizability test. Okay? This principle is sometimes, now FMP stands for fundamental moral principle. The bottom line, the single rule which can be used, according to Kant anyway, to determine what's right or wrong in any possible situation. Okay, this is sometimes known. Now, this is not the principle of utility, right? This doesn't say anything about promoting happiness or social happiness. This is not the principle of utility like Mill would believe. But this is sometimes called the universalizability principle. Universalizability principle. Okay, and sometimes people, philosophers, I mean, Kant does not use this phrase. This is kind of, a modern phrase to designate this principle. Sometimes philosophers talk about the universalizability test. Universalizability test. Okay, now let's try to understand it better. Anytime you act, you're going to have a maxim. What you should ask yourself is, could you will that maxim become a universal law for all rational beings? If the answer is no, then the action is not permissible. It's going to be wrong. If the maxim is universalizable, and I'm going to give you several examples, as Kant does, to show you which he gives examples of maxims that are universalizable and maxims that are not universalizable. If your maxim could be willed to become a universal law for all rational beings, then it's going to be permissible. If, on the other hand, the maxim fails to pass the test, if it's not universalizable, then the action that you were about to do is wrong. Okay? So again, we have to talk about a couple things. One is, why does he even think this is true? Where is this coming from? Where does universalizability, how did that just plop down into our discussion all of a sudden? And then, how is this applied in practice? Okay? So let's talk a little bit about why he thinks this is true. This is the hard part. The hard part is, why does he think this is true? So the argument he gives is something like this. It's sort of like an argument by way of elimination. I've already shown you, he thinks, he's convinced us, that whatever morality is, it doesn't have to do with promoting consequences. Whatever morality is, it doesn't have to do with acting out of inclination. So morality has something to do with acting out of reason. Now, what in the world does acting out of reason mean? It means this. Because remember what we said about reason? Reason is universal. Okay, so maybe we could put it like this. The hallmark, the badge of honor that reason has is that it is universal. When we act in ways that only everybody could act on, we are acting as rational creatures. We're acting in a universal manner. We're not acting as just me or the way even, let's say, an animal would act. I mean, Kant doesn't give this argument, but I think he would appreciate this argument. Animals act on inclination, right? Creatures, animals, beasts, they act out of inclination. They don't have reason, or they have such a low degree of reason. They don't act on the basis of universalizable principles. That's why animals don't have a moral life. We don't blame animals for doing bad things, and we don't praise them for doing good things, because animals are creatures of instinct, creatures of habit, creatures of inclination. Now, human beings are complicated. We have an animal nature. We have inclination. Sometimes we do just act out of lust or desire, or just because that's the way I feel like acting. All right? We have an animal nature, but we also have rationality. What is it going to mean to act out of rationality? It's going to be acting on those maxims which could be universal laws for all rational beings. in such a way that that could happen without contradiction. Okay, so that's where he's coming up with this. We've eliminated inclination, eliminated consequence. It has to be something about the maxim. What would make a maxim right to act on? Universality. The fact that it could be a universal law for all rational beings would make it a rational principle to guide our lives by. Okay, so essentially you could say that for Kant, morality, acting rightly, means acting rationally in this way, only acting on maxims they could be universal laws for all rational beings. All right, now, again, if you have a thought or a question about that, we can talk about that later, but I'd like to now go on to his examples. As I said, Kant did us a big favor by not only giving us this principle, but saying, here's 4 examples of how this principle is supposed to work in practice, in real life, to help us figure out what's right or wrong. Okay, so we're going to go through his 4 examples, and I'm not going necessarily in the order that they are found in his text, because I think the first one is the one I'm going to talk about. I think it's his second example, is the one that's easiest to understand. Okay, so the first example he gives is, there's going to be 4 examples. The first example that I'm going to talk about is borrowing money. It has to do with a case of borrowing money with a false promise. Okay, so you know what a false promise is, right? A false promise is a promise that you make knowing full well that you have absolutely no intention of keeping that promise. That's a false promise. Okay, sometimes we make promises and then later on we break them. That's not right either. But a false promise is just the term we use to refer to a promise that while you're making it, you're not even intending to keep it. Now, borrowing money with a false promise, what's an example? Well, imagine a person, and he asks us to imagine a real life situation. Imagine you have a person who really needs money, or they want money, and they decide that they're going to borrow money from a friend or maybe from a bank. And they promise to pay it back, but in their head they're thinking, I am not going to pay back this loan. I'm just planning on leaving the country, hiding, going into hiding, moving to another state. I'm not going to pay this back. So they're actually borrowing money with a false promise. Now, common sense morality says that's wrong, right? We all know somehow, we believe, we know, we think we know, that borrowing money with a false promise is an immoral action, okay? The question is, what is it that makes it immoral? Why is it immoral? How do we know? Why do we even think that it is immoral to borrow money with a false promise? Okay? Now, just to remind you a little bit about Mill, not to get too confusing here, but Mill would say, remember Mill is the utilitarian, he believes in consequentialism, he believes in the principle of utility. Mill would say, borrowing money with a false promise is wrong because it doesn't promote social happiness. People are going to be upset when they find out that you borrowed money and you didn't pay it back. They're going to be unhappy. You might be somewhat happy because you got away with the money, but overall, borrowing money with a false promise is going to make society less happy than happy. So according to Mill, that's why it's wrong. Okay? Now, Kant says, no, that's not why it's wrong. Borrowing money with a false promise is going to be wrong because it violates the principle of universalizability. Now, how is that so? So, anytime you're about to act, this is what Kant would say, anytime you're about to act, you should go through a 2-step process. There's a 2-step process. Step number 1, identify the maxim that you are about to act on. You have to figure out, think, what is the maxim that you're acting on? And then you have to ask yourself, does that maxim pass this test? Could I really genuinely will that that maxim become a universal law for all rational beings without any contradiction? So let's think about this. What would be the maxim of the guy who borrows money with a false promise? It's going to be something like this. Whenever I need money, I will borrow with a false promise. It's a very straightforward, simple maxim, right? When I need money, I'm down and out. What am I going to do? I'm going to borrow money with a false promise. I'm going to go to a person and say, hey, I promise to pay it back, and I'm going to lie through my teeth. That's the maxim of the person in question. Now comes the question, okay, could I, meaning let's suppose I'm that person, could I will it to be the case that that maxim become a rule that everybody acts on all the time? That all rational beings, whenever they need money, they borrow money with a false promise? So Kant says, right away you can see, your mind can see, that that's impossible. Because if everybody's borrowing money with a false promise all the time, no one can possibly lend money, right? Imagine a world in which everybody borrowed money with a false promise. The banks would close, or at least they would stop lending money. Someone would come into your office and say, hey, I'd like to borrow some money. You'd laugh in their face and throw them out, right? So to use a more contemporary term, we could say that the maxim of this guy who wants to borrow with a false promise is self-defeating. What I mean by that self-defeating is that he can borrow money with a false promise. He can. I mean, physically, he's able to do that. He can choose to do that. He can decide, I'm going to act on my inclinations and I'm not going to be rational. He can choose to do that, but the maxim, when universalized, would be self-defeating. Okay, because the practice of borrowing money assumes that people are, for the most part, lending and borrowing and not cheating, at least not every time, right? So that is an example of a maxim that fails to pass the test. Not all people can borrow money with a false promise all the time whenever they need, and therefore the maxim is not universalizable. Therefore the action, as Kant might say, violates our rational nature, and therefore the action should not be done from the point of view of a rational being. Okay? That's what makes the action of borrowing money with a false promise. The maxim fails to pass the test. Now, if that doesn't make sense to you, I'm going to give you another example. This is not Kant's example, but this is kind of like a takeoff on number one. I made this example. Well, maybe I didn't make it up. I probably heard it from somebody else and just forgot who I heard it from. Maybe I didn't. It doesn't really matter. Let's talk about something which maybe is not as serious as borrowing money with a false promise, but let's talk about barging to the head of a line. You got me? Barging to the head of a line? Like, let's suppose you're in the cafeteria, or you go into a bakery. You go into a bakery, an old-fashioned bakery, and there's people who are, waiting in line. There's a line. I guess you have lines. There still is such a thing as a line in our society, right? You go to the cafeteria, there could be a line waiting to get your coffee, your bagel, your whatever. All right? So let's suppose you go in, there's a line. Now, let's suppose you're contemplating, you're in a rush. You want to get to your class. You want to get through. You have to go do your thing. And you're thinking, listen, I'm just going to barge to the head of the line. I'll just, go up and barge to the head of the line. And maybe you're bigger or stronger than other people. Maybe you're carrying a weapon or something. You look menacing. So you figure, hey, I can do this. No one's going to stop me. Is that moral or immoral? What do you think? Just common sense, morality. Is it morally right to barge to the head of a line? The answer is no, right? There's something wrong about barging to the head of a line. Now, what is it that makes it wrong? So Mill is going to say, I keep contrasting Mill with Kant. Mill's going to say, well, barging to the head of a line, first of all, it's obnoxious. People look at you and they're upset, they're displeased. It causes, distaste, mental anguish. right? You might get some benefit out of barging to the head of the line because you'll get your bagel and your coffee quicker than all those people, but you're doing something that causes social unhappiness, net loss. There's a net loss of happiness in society if you barge to the head of the line, right? You might be, put out by the fact that you have to wait online, but, what about all those people who are there? They're going to be displeased, and the guy in front of you and the guy who would have been in front of you, he's going to be displeased. You add all that up, so social happiness is clearly improved if you don't barge to the head of the line, so that's why, according to Mill, that's why barging to the head of a line is wrong. Okay? Kant, it doesn't have anything to do with causing happiness, unhappiness, making people uncomfortable. The question is, number one, what's your maxim? If you were to do that, if you were to barge to the head of the line, what is your maxim? And then the second question has to be, is your maxim something that could be willed to become a universal law for all rational beings without contradiction? Well, let's work this through. It's a little more complicated than what we said with Mill, but the maxim is going to be something like, whenever I'm in a rush, I barge to the head of a line. Something like that, right? Whenever I need to get through, I need to get my bagel and coffee quickly. Whenever my time is important, whenever I need to do this because of my time constraints, I will barge to the head of a line. All right, so that's the maxim of the person who would be barging. And then the question should be, could I will it to be the case that all rational beings, whenever their time is precious, whenever they wanted to, whenever they needed to, they would barge to the head of a line? Well, what would happen to the whole practice of lines is that there wouldn't be any lines, right? Everybody coming into the cafeteria would be thinking, my time's important, I'm going to the head of a line. But if everybody does that, there's no line. Right? The whole practice of barging to the head of a line can only be done if some people are keeping the line. It's the same thing with lying or breaking promises, right? If making a false promise can only be done in a world in which people trust each other for the most part, and for the most part people aren't breaking their promises. Okay, that's what I mean by self-defeating. The maxim of a guy who chooses to barge to the head of the line, and then, he could do it. Let's say, Kant isn't saying you don't have free will. You do have free will. You can choose to barge to the head of the line if you want to. But you're violating this rule, which tells us, according to Kant, this rule tells us what it is to act as a perfectly rational being. A perfectly rational being would act in this way. Okay? And so there's something irrational about acting on a maxim which would allow you to borrow money with a false promise. So therefore, this turns out to be wrong. It falls into this category. The maxim is not universalizable, therefore the action is wrong. Okay, that's example number one. And again, we can discuss this later, if you have any questions about this, but let's see some more of examples. Another example that he gives is has to do with helping someone in distress. Now you'll notice that this is something that's a good thing to do morally, right? I'll give you an example. Obviously there are many, many examples of this sort, but just to paint the picture for you, suppose you're driving on the highway. You're in the middle of the desert. Let's say you're in out west in Utah, where you drive for miles and miles without seeing anybody. There's no phone service, there's no cell phone service, and you're driving, and you see on the side of the road someone's broken down, and maybe it's a little old lady and she's waving a flag, help me, blinkers, flashing lights, please help me. Okay, so you're driving and now you have to make a decision. Should I stop and see if I could help this person? Or maybe I should just ignore and keep going. That's your moral dilemma here, okay? Well, common sense morality says it would be the right thing to do. It would be morally praiseworthy, right? To stop and see what you can do to help this person. Maybe they're really desperate. They could be dying of thirst. Who knows what? The morally right thing to do would be to help that person in distress. Okay? Or think of another example might be you're rich, you're wealthy, and someone comes and knocks on your door and asks for some charity, and you can tell they're not faking, they're not going to use the money to buy drugs, they really need food, and you have the opportunity to help that person in distress. Would it be the right thing to do? Yes. Common sense morality says, yes, it would be the right thing to do. Question, why? What is it that makes it moral? Why do we think in the first place that such a thing is a moral obligation? All right, well, let's go back to Mill for a minute. Mill, social happiness. You are rich. You are doing okay. You're driving on the highway, no problem. You could sacrifice a little time, a little money, whatever it is, help this person. You're going to be a little bit unhappy because you had to stop or because maybe you had to give this person a check. Okay, maybe it kind of hurts your wrist to write checks, or, I don't want to even give you a sandwich because I was going to eat that sandwich myself. Yeah, you're going to be a little less happy, but that person who really needs the sandwich, or the little old lady who really needs the help on the highway, she's going to be so happy, right, that somebody helped her. And so an obvious utilitarian calculation here would indicate that the right thing to do is to help the person in distress, right? That's Mill. Kant? Not exactly. That's not how it's supposed to work. According to Kant, it has nothing to do with making people happy, making yourself happy. It has to do with the fact that you have to consider, if you don't, so now we have to work backwards. What would your maxim be if you did not help this person in distress? Okay, so let's just think about that. Again, what would the maxim be? What maxim would you be acting on if you were to ignore the person who's in distress or in need? Okay, now, the maxim would be something like, so long as I'm doing okay, I ain't helping anybody. I mean, that's not exactly word for word what Kant says in the book, but basically that's what the maxim would be. So long as I have nothing to gain from this action, I will ignore someone who is in need. Okay, that would be my maxim. Now I have to ask, could I really genuinely will that this maxim become a universal law for all rational beings? That means I have to imagine. You have to use your imagination a little bit, but it's not like fantasy imagination. It's just like considering what would the situation be if nobody helped anybody in distress ever. Well, Mill would say right away, oh, well, that's going to be very unhappy. But wait a second, Kant says, forget about happiness. Let's just think about, would it be a rational situation? Would it be rational for me to will that nobody help anybody else ever? And here Kant says something interesting. He says, if I contemplate that hypothetical situation, I realize that in that world in which nobody helps anybody, I would be not helped if I was in distress, right? If I was in the person's shoes, if I was the person who needed the money, if I was the person who had broken down on the highway, and I had willed that nobody help anybody else, at that moment, my will would be in contradiction with itself. I would want people to help me, naturally, but I would have willed that nobody help anybody else. So there would be a kind of a contradiction. There would be something irrational. I would have willed that nobody help anybody else, but then if I'm in distress, I would want people to help me, so I would have willed something that now I would will not to be true. So my will would be in contradiction with itself. That's what he says about the maxim of someone who would ignore someone who's in distress. So the maxim, in that case, the maxim of not helping becomes not universalizable, which now implies that helping is the only right option. Okay? This may sound kind of convoluted and complicated, but that's the theory. That's the way it's supposed to work. I realize that not helping is something that not all rational beings could act on that maxim all the time without contradiction. So it turns out that helping someone in distress is obligatory. Okay? All right. Again, we can come back and talk about questions or thoughts you might have about this, but I'm going to march along with the next two examples that he gives, okay? So another example that he gives is I hope this doesn't depress anybody or bring back bad memories, but I'm not joking, but this has to do with suicide. Okay, I know that suicide is something that probably at least one or two people in this class have dealt with in terms of friends or family, so I don't take this topic so lightly, but this is the example he talks about, suicide, okay? So let's imagine a situation in which a person is depressed, sad, whatever, they're not, let's suppose it could be, just to make the example, let's suppose we're not talking about someone who's 95 years old in the hospital who's like dying of cancer. Let's suppose we're talking about a young person in their 20s and they're kind of depressed and unhappy with their life, and they just got shamed on Facebook or blah, 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 and now they're contemplating committing suicide. That kind of a case, all right? So Kant thinks, what does common sense morality say about this? At least according to Kant, his common sense morality says committing suicide would be immoral, okay? It may not be as bad as killing somebody else, but committing suicide is a kind of murder. You're murdering yourself. So Kant, as traditional Western ethics goes, suicide is considered to be, it's certainly true in Christianity, I believe, right? That suicide is considered a sin. Am I right? My Christian friends, help me out here. Okay. In Judaism, Islam, is suicide considered a sin of some sort? Right. Okay. So it's a very universally accepted concept that suicide is wrong. It's immoral. Okay, so we all believe, or at least let's say a lot of us believe that it's wrong. The question is why? What is it about suicide that makes it immoral? Okay, well, I'll go back to Mill for a second here, or maybe 2 seconds. Why would Mill say that suicide is wrong? It would have to do with the net loss or net gain in happiness produced or unhappiness produced. So, for example, the way Mill would think about it would be, well, if you commit suicide, you're going to cause unhappiness to others around you, your family, your friends, if you have any. But not only that, what's really more serious is you're damaging yourself. You're depriving if you commit suicide, you'd be depriving yourself of your future entire life, which let's suppose that if you went to counseling, you went to some therapy, you could get over the unhappiness, the depression. Maybe you need to take a few drugs, I don't know. But imagine if you're in your 20s and you're contemplating suicide, if you can only get over that depression and get back to a normal, basically happy, healthy life, you could lead a productive life. You could maybe get married and have children. Who knows? You could have a business. You could become a charitable person. You have so much potential. Every individual has an amazing amount of potential to bring happiness to themselves and to the world. And if you commit suicide, you're basically knocking all of that possibility out. Okay, so this is why, by the way, maybe I should have talked about this more. I'm kind of backtracking a little bit to Mill, but this is one reason why murder is so bad. Why is murder so horrible? Well, you not only cause unhappiness to the family and the friends of the people that you murdered, let's suppose, But that person, you've deprived that person of all the future happiness that they would have had. And that's a tremendous impact on the social happiness. You killed them because you didn't like them, or you stole money from them, so you killed them. So what happiness did you gain, and what happiness did you cause to be lost? It's amazing. It's tremendous, right? So anyway, getting back to suicide, what would Mill say? Suicide is wrong because, in general, it promotes social unhappiness. Now, on the other hand, when it comes to, let's say, suppose you are old, like very old, and suppose you're 95 years old, and you're sick, and you're ill, and you're in the hospital, and you're probably dying of, let's suppose you've got some illness, you're going to be dying within a few years anyway, okay? And let's suppose you feel like you're a big burden on your family, right? Your family's paying for your bills, blah, 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 and they're, slowly watching this person pass away is very painful. This is a bit of this, some of us might find this disturbing, but the truth is that according to Mill's theory, it could very well work out that committing suicide might actually be the right thing to do from the point of view of the principle of utility. If you're going to save a lot of unhappiness, you're already 95, you don't have that much more to go anyway, you're not going to be contributing to society, you're draining the resources of your family by staying in the hospital. So it looks like, according to Mill's principle of utility, it could turn out that in those cases, committing suicide might actually be the morally right thing. Okay, now whether you think that's, whoa, you might think, oh, that shows me that I don't agree with Mill. Or you might say, no, I agree with that. Anyway, that's getting back to Mill. Again, it's always going to turn for Mill, it's always going to turn on this calculation of, will my action promote social happiness or not? If it does, it's the right thing. If it doesn't, it's the wrong thing. So killing versus not killing in and of itself is neither right nor wrong. What's going to be right or wrong is, does it promote happiness or does it promote unhappiness? What's the net gain? What's the net loss? That's Mill. Let's go back to Kant. Kant says, well, it's not about the consequences. It's not about promoting happiness or unhappiness. All of that is irrelevant. What we need to do is, step number one, identify the maxim of what I would be acting on. Identify the maxim that I would be acting on if I did commit suicide. And then consider whether my maxim could be universalizable. Could I will that maxim become a universal law for all rational beings? Okay, so there's always that two-step process. Identify the maxim, and then ask, could I will it to become a universal law for all rational beings? Well, the maxim of the person, again, going back to my example, somebody who is unhappy, depressed, they don't have any friends, they're tired of living, and now they're contemplating committing suicide. The maxim would be something like, whenever I'm sad, whenever I'm really unhappy, I will take my own life. That's the maxim. The maxim is not that complicated. Whenever I'm depressed and unhappy, I will execute myself. Okay? Now that is not a maxim that somebody can act on repeatedly, because once you do it, you can't have an opportunity to do it again. However, I could consider whether all rational beings could act on that maxim without contradiction. So Kant argues, this is clearly irrational. A creature who kills himself out of self-love, because that's what's going on. The person is saying, I love myself. I don't want to feel unhappy. I don't want to feel sad. I'm tired of this depression. So therefore I'm going to kill myself. There's something not rational going on here. Okay? There's something, it's a violation of your nature as a rational being. A creature who commits suicide out of self-love is doing something that doesn't make sense. And that's what makes it wrong. Okay? This may sound very peculiar to you, but What makes it wrong is not the fact that it causes pain or suffering or grief. What makes it wrong from Kant's point of view is that it goes against your nature as a rational creature to do something like that. All right, that's the suicide example. And again, we can talk about this, we can argue about it, but that's the example of suicide. And the last case he gives has to do with cultivating one's talents. All right, cultivating one's talents. All of us have certain talents or potentials that we could utilize to develop, whether it's a talent to become a teacher, a professor, a lawyer, a doctor, a salesperson, a nurse, whatever it is you're into. Everybody has certain talents. You can't necessarily cultivate all of your talents. Maybe that's just not feasible, right? You can't be both a doctor, a lawyer, a sailor, and a basketball player at the same time. Some people have different talents that they can cultivate, but to a large extent, we all have talents. And so here's a question. Do we have a moral obligation to cultivate our talents? The opposite of that would be living what we might call a lazy life. Okay, so think about this question. Do I have a moral obligation? Think about it for yourself, or think about it for, other humans. Do we have an obligation to cultivate our talent, to develop our talents, or at least some of them? Or could we just decide, you know what, I'm just going to live a lazy kind of life? Now let's just suppose, a lot of us are in the position where we have to cultivate some talent because we need to get a job, because we need to make money, because otherwise we're going to be, poor and unhappy in that way. But just for the sake of argument, imagine that you are rich. Imagine that maybe some of you are, I don't know. Imagine you inherited, thousands and thousands of dollars from your grandma, and now you're set for the rest of your life. You're 20 years old, 25 years old. Imagine you don't have to work another day in your life. If you wanted to, you could just sit at home doing nothing all day. But yet you know that you have certain talents. You could become a doctor, a lawyer, a nurse, an educator, or something, a business person even. So would it be immoral to live a lazy life? Mill would say, you bet it would be, right? Mill's going to say, you have an opportunity to promote social happiness, right? You have an opportunity to develop your talents and contribute to society. So Mill would say, definitely you have a moral obligation to do something that will promote the happiness of society at large, and your own happiness as well, of course, right? So Mill would say, yes, you have an obligation to promote to cultivate your talents. If we could just backtrack for 1 minute to Hobbes, what do you think Hobbes would say about this? Maybe we talked about this. Did we talk about the morality of laziness or immorality? We did. We did, Josh?
Yeah.
Okay.
You gave an example, like someone who just sits inside all day, but still fulfills their societal.
Right. Okay. So thank you. We talked about it with Hobbes. Hobbes would say, cultivating your talents. If you don't want to, that's your business. As long as you're not violating social contract. Remember Hobbes' theory, social contract. So Hobbes would totally disagree with Mill and say that that's up to you. That's an option. If you're rich and wealthy and you don't want to cultivate your talents, that's your business. It's not going to be immoral, according to Hobbes. Okay, now let's go to Kant. Kant wants to argue that it is a moral obligation to cultivate your talents. He agrees with Mill, but not for the reason that Mill said. Okay, Mill's reasoning was, well, if I cultivate my talents, I'll be more contributing to society, social happiness, right? Kant says that what would be the maxim of the again, two-step process. What's my maxim? If I were, in this case, to not cultivate my talents, my maxim would be something like, so long as I don't really need to, I won't cultivate my talents. So long as I don't need the money, or so long as it doesn't really help me, financially. I don't really need it financially. Let's suppose I'm wealthy, or I'm happy with whatever I have. So long as I'm in that situation, I will not cultivate my talents. Now here, Kant says, you could imagine a world in which people just sort of lived lazy lives, if they were lucky enough. In fact, he actually mentions this, I forget the name of the island, but there's some island where the people on this island were known to live a very lazy kind of life, because I guess they had the weather and the fish, and they had, trees, coconuts. I don't know exactly what kind of island they were living on, but it was a situation where they didn't need to work hard to live. So they didn't develop their talents. They just sat around all day on the beach surfing, I guess. I'm not sure about the example. Maybe they didn't surf, but I guess they had to do some fishing. It's a little bit strange. But you can imagine a hypothetical situation in which it happens to be the case that we have a lot of wealth, and we don't really need to work to make money, and we could just basically do nothing all day, okay? But sit on the beach and just do nothing. Okay. So Kant says it's possible. It's not like the case of a world in which everybody's lying at the same time and making false promises. That's like a crazy, impossible world. But in this case, it's conceivable that you could have a situation where people hang around doing nothing all day because they happen to be fortunate enough to have enough money to do that. Okay? But Kant says a rational being necessarily wills to develop his or her talents. There's something irrational about having potentials and capacities that you have and not acting on them. There's something about that doesn't make sense. And he kind of just leaves it at that. A rational being would cultivate his or her talents. And so therefore, this maxim of not cultivating your talents is not rational. It fails to pass the test. And therefore, as a rational creature, you have a duty. What do you mean duty? Duty means it's rational to do. For Kant, duty basically boils down to rational, right? If something is a duty, that means it flows from this universalizability principle, which tells us what's rational to do as a rational creature. And so therefore, not cultivating one's talents doesn't pass the test. So it turns out that cultivating one's talents is obligatory, meaning it's consistent with the principle of universalizability, and therefore it is the right thing to do. Okay, that is the last example that he gives. Okay, we'll stop the lecture here.